The auctioneer raised his gavel. Then the courthouse doors slammed open. Armed officers stormed in, flanked by a federal agent bearing the seal of the U.S. Senate. "Cease the proceedings," he ordered, voice cutting like a blade. But what happened next will shock even those who thought they'd seen everything. But first, let's go back to the beginning. The wind cut hard across the fields, stripping the color from the winter sky as Harold Hawk Wexler stood at the edge of the porch, the creaking boards beneath him groaning like old bones. In the distance, his scarecrow slumped in the frozen soil, its tattered flannel waving like a white flag no one had asked him to raise. A faint rust stain trailed down from the metal staples that pinned the eviction notice to the wooden gate, still fluttering from the sheriff's visit that morning. March 3rd. The auction date wasn't just a deadline, it was an execution. Inside the farmhouse, Hawk moved with the deliberate slowness of someone measuring memory with each step. The floorboards, warped from years of boot steps and spilled coffee, still held the warmth of a family that used to fill the rooms. Before the war, before the cancer, before the valley started emptying out to make room for high-speed fiber lines and imported landscaping stone. He paused near the kitchen table, fingers brushing across a child's drawing still stuck under a magnet on the fridge. "Grandpa's tractor," spelled out in shaky block letters. His throat clenched. They hadn't visited since the lawyers started circling. He passed the window, catching his reflection in the pane. Silver beard untrimmed, shoulders stooped not from age but from the weight of something heavier. Betrayal. He had given this country more than most. Carried men out of jungles, wrote letters to mothers with blood on his boots, came back to silence and a plot of land the government promised would be his. But now that same government had redrawn the lines, shifted the codes, and turned loyalty into liability. In the corner of the hallway stood an old cedar chest, scuffed from decades of quiet endurance. He knelt with effort, hand trembling slightly as he flipped the latch. Inside lay rows of velvet boxes, brass glinting beneath mildewed cloth. His bronze star, Purple Heart. A folded flag once handed to him with solemn words and practiced sympathy. Hawk stared at them like artifacts from another man's life. None of it had stopped the county from labeling him non-compliant. Outside, a crow perched on the fence post, black against gray. Hawk watched it for a long time. Then, with steady fingers, he pinned his medals to the breast of his worn denim jacket. Not for protest, not for pity. Just as a reminder that while they could take his land, they would not rewrite who he was, not without a fight. The morning of the auction broke cold and metallic. Sky the color of spent ash and breath visible in the air like ghosts reluctant to leave. Hawk had been up before the sun, not because he slept poorly, he hadn't truly slept in days, but because there was dignity and readiness. He had ironed his old uniform jacket with the care of a soldier preparing for a funeral, even though this one wasn't for a man, but for a piece of earth that had once been his world. By mid-morning, cars lined the dirt road that led to the farm, their exhaust curling like nervous fingers around rusted fence posts. Pickup trucks parked beside Teslas. Suits stood beside work boots. Some came with checkbooks, others with rage. Veterans in threadbare bomber jackets, farmers with hands like corded rope, and young couples who'd only heard the story online. They stood shoulder to shoulder now, forming a quiet perimeter around the house that had become something larger than itself. Hawk watched it all from the porch, one boot planted like an anchor, one hand gripping the railing as if to steady the land beneath him. His medals caught the light like small suns. The envelope in his pocket felt heavier by the hour, each word inside it a silent plea to his grandchildren not to forget who he was, no matter what headline followed this day. A hush fell when the auctioneer arrived, all smug professionalism and slicked-back hair, unfolding his podium like a man unwrapping a prize. His voice cracked through the air, sharp and rehearsed. "Opening bid, $75,000. Who'll start? No one moved. Then came the thunder of doors thrown open. The crowd turned in unison. The sound of polished shoes on marble echoed like a war drum. 4 men in crisp uniforms strode through the courthouse hall, their presence cutting through confusion like a saber through fog. Behind them walked a figure in a dark overcoat, tall, deliberate, the seal of the U.S. Senate catching light like a badge of justice. Cease the proceedings. The words didn't echo. They landed. Hard. The auctioneer blinked, mouth suddenly dry. On what grounds? Veteran Integrity Protection Clause. Section 14B, the agent said without pause. Signed this morning, Senator Louise Caldwell. This land is now under federal review. For a moment, the crowd stood frozen, silence pressing in on every chest. Then came the gasps, the rising hum of disbelief, and in the middle of it all, Harold Wexler stood a little taller, not as a victor, not yet, but as a man who'd finally been heard. Not by the courts, not by the bankers, but by a country he'd never stopped believing in. The story didn't begin with speeches or subpoenas. It began in silence, long before the cameras ever turned. Years back, when funding cuts had stripped the nearby ROTC program to the bone, it was Harold Wexler who opened his gates. No ceremony, no announcement, just a firm handshake, a rusted barn cleared for drills, and his word. He offered his land like a grandfather would offer his table, freely because it was right. Cadets ran wind sprints between his fence lines, learned formation under the oaks, ate peanut butter sandwiches on his porch. Some left with stronger arms, others left with steadier minds. But all of them left with one name etched into their memory. Hawk. One of them, then a scrawny kid from Illinois with too much nervous energy and a father in prison, stayed longer. He split firewood, fed chickens, sat at the edge of the porch while Hawk taught him how to read terrain like a language. That same kid grew up, earned a commission, and eventually took a quieter path, behind desks, behind policy. Today, he was chief of staff to Senator Louise Caldwell, and when he saw the viral headline, Veteran Faces Auction Over Disputed Land Taxes, his coffee spilled across the briefing table. His hands trembled not from surprise, but from shame. He never asked for credit, he whispered to Caldwell. He just gave everything. Senator Caldwell had buried a brother in a flag-draped box flown back from Fallujah. She didn't ask for more details. She read the article once, looked at the photos twice, then locked the door to her office. By midnight, the emergency motion had been written. By dawn, it was on the floor of the Senate Armed Services Committee. Her signature dried before the court clerk in Hawks Town had even poured his morning coffee. At the press conference, she stood without notes. There is no honor in platitudes, she said. Harold Wexler didn't serve for thanks, and he sure as hell shouldn't have to beg to be remembered. That land was training ground when our budgets failed. It fed soldiers when the system faltered. We owe him more than silence. Charles Sloan, ever the strategist, scrambled. His lawyers took to the airwaves, spinning yarns of political theater and regulatory overreach. But the public wasn't buying. The story had grown teeth. Vets across the country, from El Paso to Buffalo, posted their own memories, their own scars. Hashtags turned into movements. And before long, developers were staring down a wall of federal injunctions and a nation too angry to ignore. For once, Hawk wasn't holding the line alone. He was the line. And finally, the country he served stood shoulder to shoulder beside him. The wind was warmer now, softer around the edges. Where once frost clung like stubborn grief to the window panes and soil, now crocuses pierced the ground like small declarations of survival. The valley, still scarred from winter's bite, breathed with the first sighs of spring. The signs that once flapped in protest, auction, March 3rd, were gone, replaced by a bronze plaque anchored to a stone base near the gate. Wexler Field, preserved in honor of service and sacrifice. It caught the light differently than anything else on the farm, like it didn't belong to the earth, but to something higher. Harold Hawk Wexler never stood before it, not once. He'd glance at it on his way to the fields, nod at it maybe, but he didn't need a plaque to tell him what he already knew. His loyalty had never been ornamental. It had been grit under his nails, sweat in the soil, and years of quietly carrying on. And now, in the lull of legal battles and fading headlines, he did the only thing he understood. He worked. He moved slower these days, his right leg dragging a little more, but his rhythm was steady. The fields still needed turning, and the coop still needed mending. Only now, he didn't walk them alone. His granddaughter, Lucy, with ponytails wild and shoes always untied, ran after the chickens like they were secrets she needed to catch. His grandson, Jacob, newly 15 and learning to hold the tiller straight, asked questions with his hands more than his voice. Hawk let them. There were lessons best learned through doing. He didn't speak of the cameras anymore, or the letter from the Pentagon now framed in the hallway. He didn't talk about the senator's visits or the flood of thank-you notes that came from men he'd never met. He only said grace before dinner, and when he looked out over his land, it was with the eyes of a man who had survived not one war, but two, the one overseas and the one waged quietly here at home. But on the day the breeze shifted and the air held the scent of thawed earth and sun-warmed pine, Hawk retrieved an old bundle wrapped in canvas. The flag, faded, frayed at the edges, but whole, still smelled faintly of machine oil and smoke. He carried it to the pole in the center of the field, the one rusted by time, forgotten by ceremony. As he raised it, the cloth unfurled not just into wind, but into history. Behind him, a figure stood silent. Senator Caldwell, hands clasped, eyes shining with something between reverence and restraint. "You don't owe me a thing, Mr. Wexler," she said, voice barely above the breeze. He didn't turn. "I know, but I owe this country everything." And when his hand rose in salute, it wasn't for the cameras perched behind the fence or the neighbors watching from their porches. It was for every name etched into his memory, for every acre earned through sweat, for every man who never came home to raise a flag of his own. And that moment, suspended in golden light, belonged to them all.